Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast. As always, we are brought to you by Mountaintop Fitness. Check them out if you want to get your summer body in check and prep to go further on your trap line this fall. Just use the promo code OKS30, all caps, for a free 30-day trial. Now, today's guest is very similar to me in being a reformed corporate wage jockey. And after leaving that world, he has spent the last couple of decades operating some of the most successful guide businesses in the West. Then in 2022, he sold all those companies to become, drumroll please, a YouTuber. And through his channel, Cliff promotes all types of outdoor activities and is a strong proponent of preserving outdoorsmen's rights and sensible management of wildlife. And you may have even seen him on none other than the largest podcast in the universe, the Joe Rogan Experience. Cliff Gray, welcome to the show.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. And thanks for the nice intro, dude. I like it.
Yeah, I try to spice it up a little bit. I took a little bit about what you had on your website and, added a few things in, but I think it does a pretty good job of hopefully, introducing you to the listeners.
Oh yeah, dude. That pretty much covers it. And I'm sure we'll fill in the gaps as we chat, man. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. And, so I'm fascinated by people like yourself, myself, who ultimately give up the 9-to-5 grind to live a life that focuses on the outdoors. But, I'm curious, before you pulled the plug and took the red pill of living out in nature and, working in an area that is all focused around guiding, etc., were you exposed to an outdoor life prior to jumping in, like with both feet? Did you grow up in a hunting family, a trapping family, or was this something that just came about while you were sitting behind a desk in a cubicle, bashing your head against a keyboard?
Yeah, so I think the answer is really like a mix. So I think from the outside perspective, if you looked at my family background, my real like childhood, somebody would say, okay, that actually that looks like the background of a outfitter or a guide. My dad was an outfitter. My dad guided when I was a real young kid. And then he actually changed careers when I was like a teenager. Right. So, but I was exposed to that world. The thing that's interesting about it, and the reason I kind of frame it up that way, is my father was not a real big hunter. Like at least he did it for work, and a lot of the outfitting guiding like back in the 80s, that it was more like all the cattle guys, all the guys running ranches and all the ag guys, they were involved in outfitting guiding it was just like a convenient revenue source. I shouldn't say all, but the culture was much more like that, and that was like very much what how I described my father's interaction with the hunting world. My father, like when it wasn't hunting season on like the business front, he liked fishing. Like he liked the outdoors, but he really was to this day, he's more of a fisherman at heart. And so the whole hunting thing is kind of interesting because you never know what is like the truth in your memory bank. But man, I remember as a kid just having the bug. You know what I mean? Like I always wanted to hunt. I remember begging my dad to hunt. You know what I mean? And he always preferred, like I said, to go fishing. And I hunted a lot as a kid. And it's kind of crazy to think about now because I have kids that are, entering that age range of like 10 to 12 years old. When I was that age and I got my first gun, I hunted by myself all the time, man. And I don't think, my parents were awesome parents. They kept track of where I was, but they weren't concerned about me going and hunting in the afternoon for 2 or 3 hours.
And where was this at, by the way? What state were
So
you in?
yeah, so I had like my childhood was, again, because my dad changed careers, it was mixed. So I was actually born in the Vail Valley, and I spent my early childhood there. And then it was split a little bit between the mountains of Colorado and the Front Range of Colorado. And then I spent a good chunk of it actually in Northern California, like rural Northern California. So all those places. And in all those places, really, people, I don't know how familiar you are with California, man, but that rural part, it's funny because the rural part of Northern California actually, from like not necessarily like the big game perspective, but everything else is is a crazy opportunity. I mean, there's tons of opportunity for outdoorsmen, like fishing, hunting. Like there's a variety of things people can do in that space. So I was lucky, man, because even though we bounced around a lot, and I guess, kind of had a, however you'd call that childhood, not necessarily a normal childhood. In all the places I live, man, I had access to the outdoors, and
Mhm.
I think because my parents were, they're like, as a kid, they were still figuring out life. They didn't have like a normal corporate existence and a normal like career trajectory. Neither one of them did. They were entrepreneurs at heart and they bounced around to different things. Um, Part of that led to me being, had a lot of time to myself, my brothers too. Like I don't know, like we're pretty self-reliant in a sense at a young age. And so I did get quite a bit of exposure to the hunting world as a kid because of that. Long-winded answer, man.
No, that's awesome. And that Northern California, is that kind of in the same area where that terrible mountain lion attack happened? And is that kind of in that
Yeah,
same?
not too far from there.
Yeah,
Like that's go ahead.
and were mountain lions just as bad back then too? I guess in the early '90s or
I
whenever this
don't
was.
Yeah, I saw him several times, like in the '90s, and we'd see tracks and stuff. But from what I've heard since then, I have a few friends and clients over the years that are that have ranches in California, and they all say that for sure the population in the last like 15-20 years has increased, and that they see that more in their blacktail populations and that sort of thing.
And then in all your exploits, and for people who haven't had the chance to, please go check out Cliff's YouTube. I'll put it in the show notes. You're doing a little bit of everything now, aside from just being out in the wilderness doing big game hunting. But in all your exploits, spearfishing, big game hunting, have you done or been exposed to much trapping throughout your life?
Yeah, so I have been, and the thing is like you mentioned all the exploits. I want to be really clear, dude, because people ask me about this all the time. People actually like bust my balls a little bit about it because like the whole YouTube thing is like you got to be niche, right?
Mhm.
Well, I can't be niche because I have a disease. You know what I mean? Like this is not like I understand that being into spearfishing and elk hunting and all these different outdoors things is not normal, but it's my personality. You know what I mean? So I'm like kind of forced, like I have to put some spearfishing stuff up on my YouTube channel, even though it does horrible because everybody just thinks I'm like my brand is elk hunting, but I have to do it because it's like one of my obsessions. You know what I mean? And I went through the same deal with the trap, on the trapping front. And my introduction to trapping, my first introduction was actually in California. So and I'm sure like the statute of limitations is way over on this, and I have no idea if it was legal. But my first gig I remember my first gig was working for a high fenced orchard, a walnut orchard,
Hmm.
and I had two jobs, man. I would tie the little baby trees to the support pole, which is like the most boring job ever. You like it was back when you had like a Walkman. You put your Walkman on and you walk down the rows of these little baby walnut trees and you tie each one with a little ribbon to the support pole. It's like like the most monotonous thing ever. So I had that part of my job, and then as like a plus, they let me trap coyotes on the high fence because the whole place was high fenced. And so that was like my first introduction to trapping. And man, I actually learned a lot during that period because I had, even before I had that gig, like I mean when I was 12, 13 years old, I had hunted those areas a lot for blacktail and pigs and all the species they have there. And man, when I started trapping coyotes, you real quickly learn some stuff that you're not going to learn unless you're doing that. So that was kind of my first introduction. And then all the years I spent in Colorado, in my outfitting area, when my kids were really small, me and my wife actually lived year round at our hunting lodge, and our hunting lodge was pretty darn remote, man. It's like the place where you wintered with surrounded by 5 feet of snow or whatever,
Yep.
like it was up in the mountains. And as my middle daughter, as she grew up, enough where she could get around with me. She loved we would trap marten, and
Mhm.
you have to live trap them in Colorado. And I mean, honestly, I would have trapped anything with her. And to me, it's kind of an interesting conversation around like the laws of, only being able to use live like box traps, but you can catch marten pretty readily in them. So me and her, we used to do that all the time, and we do the whole process. I have pictures of her, my middle daughter, man, when she's like 4 or 5 years old, holding up, 15 marten that are already all, they came off the board and stuff. And so it was fun, man. I think it was enjoyable. And again, like, you learn a lot because it would get me out in the woods in a time that I wasn't spending a lot of time.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I actually got my first exposure to live trapping marten this past winter season because where
Okay.
I'm at in Idaho, it's always just been boxes with conibears, right? Really quick,
Sure.
instantaneous, hang some rotten beaver meat. But I got a contract with the Association for Fish and Wildlife Associations to do some trapping or live trapping of marten for their best management practice studies. And
Okay.
what I found is, having done a few seasons of just regular old marten trapping with a conibear, to go into a live trap was challenging. So whether you knew it or
Oh,
not,
okay.
I'm curious how you and your daughter found, getting them to commit to going in a live trap, because I found it to be immensely more difficult than, just a regular old box with a conibear.
Oh, that's interesting, man. And I just didn't I like don't have the relative comparison. You know what I mean? So in terms of like the techniques we used, we would what one thing I learned about them, and this is any of your listeners who are real trappers are probably gonna laugh at this because it's gonna tell you how naive I am. But it took me a while to figure out how localized they were, and like how me and my daughter, we could trap out a little drainage pretty quick of
Mhm.
marten, like I didn't realize how local they were. So we figured that out, and then we start to kind of, have a bigger cycle that we would go through. But I remember trapping them fairly easy in the beginning, and I swear, like, the first one we caught, we were using strawberry jam. Somebody had
Mhm.
told me to use strawberry jam, and what I used to do is I used to put mallard feathers in the back of the box, and then we just put strawberry jam in there, and that worked pretty well. But when we got where we could really consistently catch them in, one, I could see their little tracks. So, and I'm sure this is like an area that got no trapping pressure, so maybe that made it easy too. But I started using this guy's scents. There's this guy, I can't remember his name, man, but he's from New Mexico, and he has all these scents and got the funniest names, like Catmandu and whatever, like these things. And I wish he's an outfitter down there too, but they come in these little jars, and there was one of those I started using, and it worked. I can't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but it worked pretty good once I figured out how to handle those things. Because, geez, dude, the potency of those scents make you almost vomit.
Yeah, yeah, doing the whole lure thing is an art in of itself, and it takes a special individual, I think, to be able to sit there and do that over and over again. But yeah, maybe we can talk afterwards and find out who it was, and I'll put it in the show notes, because we actually have a lot of, New Mexico
Oh, okay.
trappers that have been on the podcast. But this is
Uh,
actually a beautiful segue. I don't even know if you meant to set it up, but you may or may not be aware, but a year and a half ago, New Mexico, in and of itself, lost all of their public land trapping rights.
oh, no, I had no idea.
Yeah, so I know a lot of trappers from New Mexico who've left, who were making their living, but that's 68% of the state that lost all rights. It was a
Sure.
quickly introduced bill that came through, and within a year everything was gone. So, the
Right.
question I have, like, between that public land trapping ban in New Mexico, the trapping ban in California, the mountain lion fight in Colorado, and the reintroduction of wolves, there's a push for banning trapping in Vermont now. What do you see as, somebody who's been in the industry for quite a while, as the driver behind all of this?
You know, I'm gonna be long-winded on this one, man, because I've like, this is one I think about a lot, and I think now not that I'm old, but as I get older, I try to think about it more rational, man. Like when I was 20, I'd be like, well, I just, it was one of these guys that's like, I don't really care what other people's opinion is because I'm right about this and they're wrong. So now I try to think to myself, okay, why are there so many people that seem to have a very very naive understanding of life, death, and just like the circle of life on this planet, right? And I think that in me and your lifetime, man, more and more Americans have become just more and more distant to that, right? Like an example, this morning I took my oldest daughter lobster diving, and she's been trying to catch lobsters. It's like it's fairly difficult for a young kid, right?
Mhm.
There's just like the physical part of it and getting used to the water, and even for an adult, it takes a little time to get used to it. So she caught her first lobster this morning, and was super pumped about it. And I could tell, and I didn't realize this or anticipate it, but it was the first animal that she's actually ever killed, right? That for like consumption. And I could tell she was like it was a little bit of an issue. She was like a little bit, concerned about it. And so I talked to her about it in the water. I said, hey, we're going to eat these, all the food that we eat. This is, you may not see it, sweetie, but this is the process. Right. And she got over it. No big deal. No tears or anything like that. Probably part of that was it was a lobster. It looks like a huge bug. Right. So
Mhm.
makes it a little bit easier, but it was a thing to her. Right. And I was talking to my wife about it afterwards. And what's interesting is I think that right now we're dealing with a population, man, that they have that same understanding that she had, but they're not 12. They're 45 years old and they all vote. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? And just the nature of our culture, they were never they've like you can go to the grocery store and realize that all this food, all this, if we take it to the trapping world, all the clothing we wear, even if it's petroleum based, it still has an impact on this earth, right? And
Mhm.
people know that. They know that on the base level. But if you have a certain level, if you have a certain amount of degrees of separation from it, it doesn't matter if you know it, you don't really understand it. You know what I mean? And I think that's the crux of the whole issue. And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes it so difficult to fight it, because your exposure, my exposure, my kids' exposure is becoming fairly unique, man. So I try to view it in that way. Like how can I help convince people on all these, really trapping, hunting, whatever, fishing. It's what's amazing to me, man, is the fishing world is starting to become under attack, right?
Really?
Like, oh yeah, like I talk to fishermen, like there's lots of areas. There's a whole that whole world now is like there's a lot of push for closing down a lot of the fishing on the California coast to recreational fishermen. Dude, I would have never thought that
Hmm.
would be a thing. You know what I mean? So, you got trapping on one end of the spectrum. Unfortunately, for a guy like you or a lot of your viewers, like trapping has been on the chopping block for 35 years, and then
Yep.
hunting's under it, and then everything else consumptive is right there, man. It's coming right down the block too. And I think it's because just most people, they're just not around it, man. You know?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, and I guess that leads to the next question, right? Which is, what do we do about it? Because there's a couple different layers to this, right? Like, what do we do as individual communities, like the trapping community, the hunting community, the fishing community? But then there's that larger education piece. And I think, maybe this is a good time to go into, a question I had, which is, as a YouTuber, what's been the biggest recipe for success that you've seen? And I want to seed that with the underlying question of like the content you're creating. Is there like an underlying thread of trying to put out educational stuff to bridge that gap between people who are, like your daughter was with her first, kill for consumption of this lobster and just being disconnected from it? Is that part of that agenda you have, or is it just a byproduct of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was being honest, man, like I'm lucky on my YouTube, because my YouTube, it happens to be the situation where the demographic, the audience that watches it, a lot of it is late onset hunters, right? Or I mean, really, when I say late onset hunters, just like somebody who wasn't exposed to it as a kid, right? And so there are a lot of people, like a huge chunk of my audience is, grown adults that, they're 30 years old, they've got a little vacation time, they got a little disposable income, and the whole idea of going out west and killing an elk has become a goal for them, right? So I'm lucky because a lot of the audience that comes to me, man, they're open to the idea, right? Now, do I feel or hope that my content, helps them even, learn more about it and stay into that world? Yeah, totally. And that's my whole business model is based on that. But it's hard for me to say. I wouldn't say that my content is like mission driven beyond that. Now, I think there's a question. I think it's a question for me personally. Like, could I make it that way? Yeah, I think so. And I think over time, I try, particularly as I branch out into other things like the spearfishing world or whatever. I think that, the two things can coincide, right? Like it's not, because not everybody wants to go to the mountains and go elk hunting, right? But if they can go spearfishing in Florida because they live there, they live on the west or on the East Coast or whatever, that's an easier kind of hunt or, way to get their own meat. I'm all about encouraging that, if that makes sense, So, yeah, I think it's, I think, I mean, the whole, I mean, sure, I don't know how it is in the trapping world because I'm not like in tune with the day-to-day culture and like kind of the buzz. But in the hunting world, there's this very big challenge, right? Because it's a limited resource, but at the same time, you're wanting people to understand what you're doing. And the best way to do that is to get them to be a part of the extraction of that limited resource. This is a real challenge. There's a lot of hunters that would really dislike my channel because of that, right?
Yeah.
They don't want me to encourage new hunters to get into the activity that they enjoy. And I think there's like there's a legitimate debate in that. I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I also feel like I have a pretty good rationale to argue why I think that it's okay to have new people doing your thing.
Yeah, I think in the trapping side of the world, I would argue that it's almost more pertinent for trappers to be encouraging people to get involved. Because, like you said, like it's whether trappers want to admit it or not, we're at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to
Yeah.
like what's on the chopping block, right? It's been a target for 35 plus years. But we've also seen, if you talk to any of the state associations, like just drops in numbers of trappers year over
Yeah.
year. I think there's been some renewed interest, especially in states where there are pretty decent trapping opportunities.
Yeah.
But to your point, there's still, even in trapping, that same argument from within the community, like, well, if we have more trappers, then it's going to be less opportunity for me, right? That kind of
Right.
argument, just like in elk hunting, like there's going to be more people at all these trailheads. There's going to be, less
Sure.
resource available for everybody. And I'm biased too, right? Because I am an adult onset hunter, adult onset trapper. So I'm one of those people who came in and then has benefited from the community, from the resource, from,
Sure.
learning these skills. So, how do you balance that? Is there a way to balance that, either across trapping, hunting, or is it just, pushing
Yeah.
forward?
So my view is, man, there's no balance because it doesn't matter how many people I encourage to elk hunt. All of them are going to become elk hunters or enjoy that sport. Some will try it and it'll be a lifelong thing. Some will just try it once, whatever, right? And they'll become supporters of the sport. Same deal with trappers, right? Some people will enjoy it. Some people won't be for them. They'll become supporters of the sport. But man, that nominal number, you still need more than that to support the activity politically. And within the elk hunters that I encourage to join the sport or mule deer hunt, whatever, all the different hunters that come into that world, my personal view is like, look, if you're a longtime hunter, you've been hunting since you were an embryo or whatever, you're just gonna have to deal with the fact that there's gonna be rationing of the resource. Because here's the deal, like particularly when you get into public land stuff, you can say all you want about, well, there's new hunters and they're taking opportunity away from me. Well, a new hunter could say, no, I've been subsidizing you for the first 30 years of my life by not being a part of
Mhm.
this and utilizing part of the public resource. So I don't act personally. I don't think there's a rational argument to say that like somebody like me or you is ruining the sport. I think it's just it's unfortunate. I in an ideal world there would just be, I shouldn't say in an ideal world, but I think in like this imaginary world that a lot of hunters think about, there's really less humans on the landscape, and the only thing we eat is wild game, and we all have hunting seasons all year.
Mhm.
Well, that's just not this is not how it works. So if you want this to, these activities to exist when our grandkids are adults, you're going to have to share. And that's going to be part of it. And the reality is not only are you going to have to share, you're going to have to get people on board aren't even utilizing the resource. So I don't have any sympathy for them at all, honestly, man. Like, because I mean, at a bare minimum, you got to get as many people as possible involved in the activity. This idea that you're just going to slide by as long as possible, like that would work. That works for a while. Like I mean, I'm sure in the trapping world, man, somebody posting up a coyote in a foothold, it's not good for your world, because a lot of people consume that media and they've never been exposed to it. It's like it's sad, man. Like I
Mhm.
think it's sad. I think it's sad to see a foothold coyote, but I understand it, right?
Mhm.
But so I think there's things that people can do that for, from an outward exposure. Like if you're going to show that kind of stuff, make sure there's context, whatever. But beyond that, the extension of that to like, hey, we should just not talk about trapping ever, and just hope that it just lasts for as long as possible, and we'll just be quiet about it. I think, and you may disagree, man. I'm totally understand it, but I think that concept is dumb, because that means that yeah, maybe it lasts another couple years, but eventually when it gets attacked, it's so weak that it'll just vanish immediately. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and I agree with you. And you know, you actually answered one of the questions I had for you, which was about how do you, even on your channel, potentially curate content, because in the trapping world, it is very sensitive, right? Like,
Sure.
and I think most trappers agree, like you said, if you post a picture of a coyote or a wolf or any animal in a foothold that's still alive, like it's not pleasant, right? Like, I mean,
Sure.
there are ways you could probably artfully do it. Like even the Sportsman Alliance magazine that came out had a coyote in a foothold, and they did it very well, I think. And there's ways to do it, but not everybody does it well. And especially when you think of it in aggregate, when people are posting on every social media channel,
Right.
it's long-term detrimental. So like even talking about trapping on a podcast, I got drug across the coals for, some things that I said on here at one point about trapping within the community. Um, so like from your perspective, like what's your position on curating content? Like you said, like even in the hunting world, is it like limited grip and grins? Is it like how do you even
Yeah.
tell people what to do? Because I struggle with that, because it's you know, do as I say. And at the end of the day, people can always do what they want, but is it just educating people on the impacts that it can have?
Yeah, I don't know, man. This is like it's such a tricky one. You know what I mean? And I don't think I have a very good answer to it. I think that, man, it's so hard, because there's a part of me that's the same like 20-year-old like hunter that I grew up as, and like if I had social media when I was 20 years old,
Mhm.
I would have posted coyotes and snares. I would have put, like, and I would have been like, hey, if you don't like it, deal with it. You know what I mean? And now when I say that out loud, I'm like, man, I'm such an idiot, because
Mhm.
it's not, it's maybe it's like or it's very self-serving, and it probably does damage to, that activity just because there's no context around it. And so I think for me, that's like the biggest thing. And I even notice it with my content, particularly short form content. Like I went through this just as a concrete example. I went through a period of time where I was doing a lot of short form content that was like game processing
Mm,
related, right? Like here I'm gonna strip the backstrap off of an elk or a moose or whatever, and this is how I find the ball joint on an elk or whatever. And what I would find with those is that they're pretty popular amongst the hunting community and very like how to oriented, right? Like this is how I do it. And they would get popular amongst the hunting community, and then a lot of them would, blast into virality, right? Like
mm,
millions of views. And then they're getting like exposed to everybody, right? And then I started to realize like, oh, okay, if I keep doing these kind of things, I gotta at least make an effort in the caption to be very clear what's going on.
mm,
Because all the hunters know what's going on, but once it goes into like the trippy dippy world of like all these other people living like that have never stepped off the concrete, they have no idea what's going on. To
mm.
them, it's just like blood, guts, and this guy's dismembering stuff. You know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't want, like, honestly, I don't really even want somebody to subscribe to my stuff if that's what what they're interested in. Obviously,
Yep.
So it's like, okay, I got to put a little context around this. So, hey, if people find it interesting, they can look at the caption and be like, okay, this is what this guy's doing. Just like the little stuff, man. Like, hey, like this this elk is, this animal was consumed, right? Like obvious, like anybody sees me like pulling the backstrap off on an animal, like, yeah, no shit. Or like I shoot iguanas in the Caribbean a lot, and I eat the tail meat off of them. They're invasive. Like it's
Yeah.
disgusting how much damage they're doing down here. And I only eat the tail off of them. But a lot of people are repulsed by that.
Mm,
Like, well, one, they're repulsed that you kill them in the first place. And then second, they're like, oh, all you use is the tail off of them. And it's like, yeah, I'm not going to tell you that I eat the whole iguana because I don't, because there's very little meat. And it's not uncommon for me to go out and kill 80 of them. They're like
mm,
an infestation. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to spend 80 hours, pulling off, a half a bite of leg meat off of iguana. I'm not going to like tell you. So I think it's valuable for me to give the context of like, hey, the tail meat is a really efficient use of the iguana. Everybody likes it that I feed it to. They're not offended by it. It's something cool for them to consume. And this thing is an invasive species that's very problematic for these reasons. So I try to do that more, man. And it's weird because you think nobody would read the captions, but most people do.
huh.
Or most people that, like are going to interact with you, make crazy comments and stuff. Most of them will actually read a short caption first, you know. So,
Yeah, I think that's pretty sage advice. And yeah, there's a gentleman I had on this podcast who's runs a relatively successful from like a content perspective on TikTok and Instagram trapping page, but he's
okay.
also pretty methodical too in how he's portraying it. Like he leverages the captions. He kind of talks about best management practices and what's the benefit, why are they doing it, they try to they're big beaver trappers and they utilize most of the meat for consumption or for dog food or
Sure.
whatever else. And I think that plays pretty well, especially when you start to and I'm not in this space, so I don't want to pretend like I am, but
Yeah.
when you start to shoot off into the stratosphere of the social worlds and you start to get out beyond what your core audience is, I think that's a pretty necessary thing that you have to do. And I don't know when you need to start doing that if you're, Joe Schmo posting a trapping picture every once in a while on Facebook to
Right.
an audience of 30 versus, someone like yourself that might garner millions of views on a video.
Sure. Well, dude, my thought on it, honestly, man, like this is totally just just my baseline exposure to social media. Any of the short form videos, man, all of them, you gotta assume that they're gonna go berserk
Hmm.
because any of them can. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I mean, you could have 10 followers on Instagram and you post up some sort of, reel that all of a sudden it gets 10 million views.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that's the answer. Probably should try to think about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things when you think about it, like, oh, I'll never be like some influencer or whatever the case may be. But then, like you said, one post, and that's actually what happened, and how the gentleman I was just speaking to
Oh, okay.
kind of built his audiences. They were on TikTok. They had a picture of fleshing out a beaver, and it happened to look like some other country's political figurehead.
No.
Um, and that's what went viral.
Yeah.
So, you come from any angle, like you said.
Yeah,
Um,
you never know. So it's best to probably just try to put some context with things.
and so when you just going back to trapping for a little bit, I know you said you'd done some coyote work while you were in California, walking walnut tree lines and trying not to go nuts. Well, I guess that's a double fun right there. Um, and then with your daughter a little later on in Colorado, if you think back to that exposure to trapping, do you think that even a little bit of trapping has made you a better guide or a better hunter? And the reason I ask is, the amount of effort it goes in to try and, you know, get a pine marten in a live trap. Do you see that as more effort or the same effort as, hunting, or how that's played into a little bit about your guiding life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that trapping would probably fall into the category of one of those things that I did for fun, and then
Mhm.
along the way, I probably had like sparks of things I'd noticed that helped me go up the learning curve quicker than I anticipated. The other really big one for me that did this, that's it's hunting, but it's like a lot of people view it as a different style of hunting, is like hound hunting.
Mhm.
I would have never thought before I did a lot of hound hunting, I would have never thought that that would have taught me a ton about deer, elk, those species that I hunted. Like, but lion hunting taught me an enormous amount about that. And I feel like trapping's the same way, like little glimpses of things like, I mean, I can, I remember, trapping coyotes. What you quickly learn is, the thing that struck me, and this, I mean, just so your audience knows, this is like 25 years ago. I was like a kid, right? And not everything works out perfect every time, but you start trapping coyotes with lethal snares, you're going to quickly catch things that you wish you didn't,
Mhm.
right? Raccoons, whatever. And you learn really quick how to stop doing that. You
Mhm.
know what I mean? And that was something that I learned during that period of time. And you start to learn like what a coyote trail looks like versus a deer trail, right? What a trail like I learned, like, really, they sound like simple things probably to a trapper, but you'll find an area where deer have been going through a fence, right? And you can see they've been going through a fence, but you have no idea. Like, a lot of these areas, like around ag, the deer are pretty nocturnal, particularly if they get a lot of hunting pressure. Well, like blacktail in particular are like this. And the thing about blacktail is, if you're gonna spend your time in like these thick river bottom stuff in California trying to kill a buck, you got to know where a buck trail is, right?
Mhm.
Well, I had no idea how to figure that out until I started trapping, and I realized, like, okay, I can look where deer go through the fence, and I can tell you if it's groups of does or fawns because I'm catching hair on the top of the
Mhm.
barbed wire and on the bottom where the fawns go under. You know what I mean? And then if I'm trapping coyotes, I stay the hell away from that. You know what I mean? But in that process, I learned that, hey, I can look at all this deer sign and I can start to tell you exactly where bucks are moving through the fence line. You know what I mean? And so little things like that I picked up from trapping that are totally like that I would never know that. I would never know that if I hadn't done that. Like, there's a lot of things I learned about wintering bull elk from hound hunting,
Hmm.
right? Like, I would have never expected some of the spots that bull elk winter. I would have never expected that they would have been in there. And this is, I mean, I spent years around elk, like living in, in the mountains where, the primary ungulate was elk. And I didn't know that, hey, like, bull would, literally winter up in this little spot way later than somebody would think they would. So stuff like that. Does that answer your question?
It does. And now I'm just curious on the hound hunting. So you were out cat hunting and running dogs, and then you would just come across bull elk way out in, like, thick snowed high elevation areas.
Yeah. So what I like, one of the things I learned about elk from hound hunting, bull elk in particular, not cows, what you would do is like you'll find that some lions in the mountains in the wintertime, they're only killing bull elk, which seems really counterintuitive, right? Like why would a lion want to get a hold of one of the species that's 30% bigger than the rest and has antlers? I mean, they have their antlers through the dead of winter, into the spring. So why would they do that? Well, it's because what you learn, at least in those geographies where the elk migrate, is the cows will, once the cows go down and they get pushed by snow, they'll stay down for the most part. Bulls in it, they, particularly in hunted areas, I noticed this, but bulls will, any chance they get to go back up, if there's a little hellhole up there that's got a little feed, a south facing slope, or something that either gets hit by the sun or gets windswept or whatever, and they got a little running water that doesn't freeze up, they got these little spots that are at higher elevation. If the snow creeps back in there and they can get back up there, they'll go right back up there. You know what I mean? And I learned that from hound hunting, because the lions love to kill them when they do that, because they're by themselves, or they're with a couple buddies, laying up against laying up against a rim where a lion can ambush them from the top or something. And so I learned that from lion hunting, and I realized that, or I applied it to the hunting season, man, because you can have like high elevation Colorado, you could get these like monster storms mid-October, push every elk out of the high country, and you think like, okay, I'm hunting in November, are all the elk gone? And if you just kind of watch the snow line recede, the old spots, where bulls hang out, they'll come back into them. And you can hunt them in those spots. Like bulls will come off of private, and go back up. They're not going to linger in, wide open spots where a bunch of guys in orange vests can blast them. They're going to go right back into these little hellholes they know that they like. You know what I mean?
That's pretty cool. Well, I mean, that exposure of just being out there. And I think that's when I think about adult onset hunters, trappers, and I think I'm like many people, I got into hunting as an adult, drawn by elk hunting, archery elk hunting, like a lot of other people.
Yeah.
But then I started to kind of quickly spread out to other things, including trapping. And obviously that kind of took a lot of my heart, especially wolf trapping out here in Idaho. But, dabbling in a lot of different things, whether it's hound hunting, whether it's for cats or bear or whatever the case is, spearfishing if you happen to have access to it. I mean, doing all these different things, I think all kind of culminate. And it's funny where you start to see these intersections of where they all, start to bleed together a little bit and make you just an all around better outdoorsman or outdoorswoman.
Well, dude, what's crazy, not to get off the subject, but I always wonder, imagine the opportunity to go back in time and talk to a 17-year-old kid, who that's all he did. Every, like a Native American or something, like just being able to go back and talk to a kid, not even an adult man, 16, 17-year-old kid who every day he went hunting, with his group, and got a bunch of transferred knowledge, but just like the iteration, and it wasn't just hunting, it was like trapping. Like that's the thing, man. It's like I don't know if you're into this. This is like another obsession of mine, but I'm really into arrowheads, like trying to find them. And so if you're into that, you start to realize like they were like, people have this vision that they were just out there hunting. Dude, they're just trying to kill something. like to eat. If they could run it off a cliff, they could trap it, they could shoot it. It's all fair game. Like that's our history. That's my opinion is that's human history, right? And then we have a lot of constructs around that, but that's what we were kind of like born. I think that's like our intrinsic thing. I think us and wolves probably share that a little bit, right? But what I'm getting at is that imagine the knowledge, man, that kid would have had, because he's got, even though this is like my whole life or a big chunk of my life, like that 16-year-old would have probably 10,000 times the level of knowledge I would. It'd just be pretty cool, to get, to get them on a podcast.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And I'm a big history dork myself. So I think a lot about those things too, because, like you said, they're out in a more opportunistic fashion of like, hey, like this is survival. Like
Yeah.
they probably know like these frogs are coming into this
Yeah,
area,
sure.
right? But that also means then that there are deer migrating or this, that, and the other, all these different interconnected things. Like that would be amazing to pick their brains and understand how all those things work together when that's all you're
Yeah.
doing day in, day out, with tribal knowledge being passed down too.
Yeah. Yeah. But like the interconnectedness that you're getting at, like that, there's be pros at that, man, because they weren't siloed. Hunters and trappers and fishermen and spear fishermen, they're all siloed. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I mean, even like a lot of it's opportunity, right? But you have
Yeah,
like
of
the
course.
coyote trappers, you've got water trappers, and you have wolf trappers out west. A lot of them do a little bit of everything in some instances, but yeah, generally speaking, like you have people who specialize, and I think that's
Sure.
also just human nature. Like if you end up being a very successful elk hunter, and you're going to probably do a lot more elk hunting. If you're a cat hunter or a wolf
yeah.
trapper, like it becomes an identity, so to
Yeah,
speak.
for sure.
Which is hard to manage too.
Yeah. Well, it's a function too. Just have limited time. We gotta have a real way to make some income and everything else, and take
I
care of
know
folks.
jobs always get in the way of the fun, man.
Yeah.
It's an
The-
unfortunate thing that we have to deal with, I guess.
this lousy modern world of running water and electricity costs money.
Yep, and it's hard to make a full living, trapping, and people do it, and that's
Sure.
man, those guys who can pull that off are absolutely amazing. But for the vast majority of people interested in trapping or are already
Yeah, of course.
trapping, it's like myself. I
Hobby.
consider myself a hobby trapper, right? I
Yeah,
do
of
it,
course.
sell some fur, tan some fur, and do some cool stuff with it. But that's about as far as it goes for me.
Yeah.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, because I think a lot of people listening will have seen you on the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm just curious, largest podcast in the world. How did that come about, and what was that experience like?
Yeah. So yeah, how it came about. This is like, I think that people who are fans of Joe's podcast, when when you hear like little pieces of like, he says, oh, I just have whoever I want on, because people ask him like, how do you, whatever, there's this like mystery around it, and his response is always like, well, I just have whoever I want on. That's the truth, man. Like that's just how he operates. Like, to make this story short, like I knew him as like an acquaintance slash buddy for 6-7 years. We text message back and forth about hunting and questions he had on that. Like I knew him when he was fairly new to elk hunting. And the reality is he does a lot of elk hunting. And he does a lot of elk hunting that he doesn't post every time he's on a hunt or what. It's not something that he's, a big part of his like social media or whatever. So he does actually quite a bit of hunting, and he's really, he's gotten pretty darn proficient at it over the years. But anyways, I was always like a contact with him through that, either, helping him with whatever aspect of that. Right. But, how like it ended up with me on the show, it was really just like amidst one of these like prolonged, text messaging things talking about hunting or whatever. And my wife would like always laugh about this, because I always tell her, I'd be like, yeah, I'm talking to Joe Rogan. She's like, I believe you, but I don't like, this is going for like anyways. So he texted me and he's like, hey, let's do a podcast. And I was just like, it didn't register at all, man. I was like, what is he talking about? And I showed it to my wife, and my wife was just like, he means be on his podcast. And I was like, oh, holy shit, you know? And it was weird because it was a weird time in my life, man. I had sold my outfitting business, my hunting business. I had a whole lot of, just like I had done like a little mini retirement. Like I was trying to figure out next steps in my life. So it's kind of an odd time to be on like the biggest show ever. But when he asked, you go, you know what I mean? So it was funny. I was like, all right, let's do it. So I don't know, it was like a month or two later that I did it. But I remember, just as an anecdote that you might find kind of interesting, I was nervous about it. Like I've done a lot of podcasts in the hunting world, but I told him, and I like I had a close enough relationship with him. I felt it was okay to ask, like, hey, dude, like, is there anything in particular you want to talk about? Is there anything I should, prepare for? I've never done anything with that level of exposure. And his response was, hey, Cliff, just do me a favor, man. Like, I'm just having you on because we don't get the chance. I'm too busy for us to just have a conversation in person. So that's what I want to do. Please do me a favor and don't prepare. And I was like, all right. So that's what I did. And going there is it's an interesting experience, man. It's he doesn't have it's not a big a huge operation by any means. It's a couple people there, Jamie, and he's got a couple other helpers, and you show up, he gives you his tour, we checked out his archery range, all that stuff, and then you turn the corner in there and he hands you the headset, and 6 million people listen to whatever you talk about.
That's pretty awesome, man. Yeah. Were you able to get over the nerves pretty quickly?
No, dude. So I was nervous about it for a few weeks, but I felt like it was, I was like, you get to the point where you're like, well, and the thing about it is I didn't tell anybody around me until I was, my wife knew, until like I was literally like 3 or 4 days out. And then I told my family, like, hey, like, I'm going to go do this. You're probably going to hear about it, type of thing. Right. But I just kind of kept it to myself. And I feel like part of that was a strategy to not get nervous about it. Like I didn't want a bunch of people like hyping me up, like, holy crap, you're going on that thing. So I think that helped me not be nervous. But the funny thing about it, man, is I actually use, and it comes from the diving world, but I actually use like breathing techniques to control like any stressful situation, whatever, nerves or whatever. There's a concept of breathe up in diving where you do a certain type of breathing to get you ready to hold your breath. And I use that same breathe up to like calm myself down. And I remember when I went to his studio, one of his security guys comes meet you, right? This is kind of like they have a little protocol there because they don't want people showing up and harassing whatever, Joe or the podcast or whatever. So they come meet you, and I was doing this breathe up in my car, and when I do it, I have my eyes closed or whatever. And this guy, his security guys are like super cool guys, but he like knocked on the window and he's like, Cliff, are you okay? Like he like kind of was like concerned because he kind of snuck up on me while I was doing this like breathe up to not be nervous. And I think he got a kick out of it. So, but yeah, no, I was nervous, but that helped. And man, like, after 10, 15 minutes in it, it really does feel like a conversation. I think, you reflect on those things. And I've got a buddy who was on a show too, Jordan Jonas, and we both laugh about it because it's a conversation. It goes where it wants to go. I wish, reflecting on it, that, that I would have talked about some more like, real interesting hunting or outfitting stories, like exciting stuff to like a mainstream audience. I wish would have done more of that. But in the end, like, I also think you can't go into those things with some, predetermined objective, right? I think that's almost defeats the purpose of his show. So it was fun, man. I had a good time. The guy's like the amount of hospitality, he's a great dude. He took me to his comedy club had just opened, and he took me to it that night. I met Dave Chappelle, Ron White. Like it was like a day of like, I'm like, I can't believe that day just happened type of deal, you know?
That's awesome, man. I mean, it was awesome to listen to as well. You seemed comfortable. That's one of the reasons I was asking.
Oh, okay.
You always project yourself into a situation like that, and I'm like, man, I'd be sweating through 3 t-shirts or whatever the case may be. But
Yeah.
that's awesome, and obviously, I hope some of the stuff on the other end's been very beneficial for you as well, too.
Oh yeah, like that stuff for whatever reason it for sure opens opportunities, which I'm grateful for. So yeah, no, it's an interesting deal, and he's a good guy. He really is. Like anybody who's a fan of his, like uh, my positive perception of him was nothing other than expanded during my actual in person time with him. So he's a good dude.
That's awesome. And so, I want to keep us, so I don't keep you too long within the hour too, but I just have a few more questions I really want to hammer out. And these are some that I ask every guest.
Yeah.
So, as a guide in wilderness areas, what's the craziest or most bizarre thing you've ever seen or come across in the woods in your lifetime?
Yeah, the most bizarre thing that I've ever seen probably up in the wilderness areas. Um, oh, I actually have a kind of a funny one.
Let's hit it.
That so there's a spot so there's some spots in there, and it's no secret that the flat tops were like a hunting ground for the Utes. And there are caves in the flat tops that are not marked and they're not known, and I think people purposely don't talk about them, that have petroglyphs in them. There's known ones and there's unknown ones. And I remember one time when my brother was with me, and we were climbing a really remote spot. We were climbing up this canyon. Just the angle, I had been in there before, but the angle we were looking into this deep cave across, you
Hmm.
could see some paintings like back in there. And we're like, oh, like we got to go in there. Well, like how the erosion and stuff over the years had worked that hillside, you couldn't walk into it. Like they're just I assume probably when they went in there was probably like a foot and a half of whatever. Um, but they could walk in there, but that was gone. So we actually went back all the way back home. Next trip in, we brought ropes in. We rappelled into this cave, and we go in there, and there's the real deal, native painting, like Ute paintings, and then there's a lot of charcoal signatures, and you'll see these charcoal signatures. They're like graffiti from 1880 or 1900, like the first homesteaders in these areas, and they would use this charcoal, and they'll put their names, and then they would date it, right, which is pretty cool. And their names a lot of times are like the exact type of names you think of from that era, like Ginny, but Ginny, Glenda, like just like a different type of name. So it's pretty cool. You're looking through these. Anyways, dude, this whole thing. So me and my brother, we look up, and above all these names in charcoal, one of these kids from that era had drawn a big dick on the wall. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, this is hilarious, dude. Like, this is not modern. There's 100% no way where it's at that this is modern at all. And who has a charcoal pen? Like, kids are the same, 150 years ago, man. Kids were the exact same. Like, nobody's going to see this. I'm going to draw a dick in this cave. And it's just that. So that's probably one of the funnier things that I've seen up there. Kind of interesting things.
That's hilarious. But yeah, that's cool history, but also like I think we all romanticize about the stoicism of like the pioneer or the person, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, we're all just humans and we do goofy things.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty spot on.
Yeah. Just kind of a funny experience. But
All right, and then the last question I have, and this is a hypothetical. I
yeah.
usually do these, but this is given your passions, right? Would you rather only be able to spearfish for the rest of your life, or pursue your favorite big game animal for the rest of your life? And you can only do one or the other.
That's like um that's a really hard one to answer. And I'll probably give kind of more of a like maybe not a romantic answer. Like I love spearfishing. I think because I'm still fairly low on the learning curve. Like I don't over my life because of where I've lived and that sort of thing. I haven't iterated as much on it. Every time I go out, particularly at a certain level of spearfishing for me, when I'm around guys that have done it forever and they have like way more knowledge, like I think it's very hard for me to replicate that in a lot of hunting because I've become accustomed to it and iterated on it. However, I think that probably like the physical nature of spearfishing, I think I think when I'm 60 years old, 65 years old, like there's probably a limited time span for me to enjoy that activity
Mm.
at the level I want to enjoy it. Whereas big, hunting elk in a great location, in September, I think that I could probably do that until I'm 95 years old.
Mm.
Not everywhere because of, wilderness or whatever. So I think I'd have to go with big game hunting, man. Just because I feel like there'll always be some kind of big game hunting that I'll probably do for forever, if that makes sense.
Makes sense, man. Well, we're at an hour and I appreciate your time, Cliff. It's been great for me. I love learning a little bit about your background, especially some of the trapping stuff that you've done in the past. But is there anything that you've got going on or, places that people can find you to learn a little bit more about what you're doing across all your different channels?
Yeah, man. So the best way for people to just see what I'm up to is my website's pursuitwithcliff.com. That's got, I do some hunts slash like seminars, like learning experiences, but they are hunts. Those are posted on there. Links to my YouTube channel are on there. My YouTube is just my name, Cliff Gray. You can go to YouTube, stick it in the search bar, it'll pop up. And then probably the other social media that I have, that I try to keep up to date on is my Instagram. And that in my Instagram, that's Cliff Gry, CLIFFGRY. And those are people's best bet. So yeah, follow me on that stuff.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. I know you're down in the Caribbean, so I'll let you get back to the sun before it goes down and maybe get a few more lobster and get those all
Yeah,
cooked up for dinner, man.
yeah. Thanks, man. I really enjoyed it. You had great questions, dude.
Awesome. Well, everybody, we'll check you out on the next episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast. Till next time.